he said, if things don't change, you probably only have 4 to 6 weeks to live. He had chemo and radiation planned for right after the swim was over.
This is
Because
the
he didn't want to
amazing
do it
part.
before,
Yeah.
because he knew it would make me weak, and I didn't want to do it before either. So we put it off till after the swim. And then the first blood test I took after the swim, miraculously, we found the leukemia was gone. So I said, hey, nature healed my leukemia. Nature probably also has the power to heal my lymphoma. And that's when I found Dr. King Lee's research on forest bathing. So I started this in May of 2015, and by March of 2016, my lymphoma was totally gone. I was totally in remission there.
You inspire me to be the higher me. You're my inspiration to creation.
שלום לכולם וברוכים הבאים לפודקאסט השראה להבראה. Welcome to my podcast Inspire to be higher.
Deep within, let your dreams begin.
Hello everyone and welcome to Inspire to be higher. I'm Shira and today it is my privilege to introduce Dean Hall, an extraordinary individual whose life story stands as one of the most inspiring I have ever encountered. Dean has transformed monumental challenges, including battling both lymphoma and leukemia, into profound opportunities for healing, growth, and adventure. Dean is a coach, a speaker, and a man who cured himself from cancer through cold plunges and forest bathing. His journey is a testament to resilience, creativity, and the transformative power of a deep connection with nature, as captured beautifully in his book, The Wild Cure. Dean's experiences remind us all of the extraordinary potential within us when faced with life's toughest obstacles. So, Dean, thank you so much. I was kind of a stalker ever since I started this podcast. I was looking how can I get Dean in an interview. So I'm so glad you're here, and because I really want everyone to hear your amazing story, which is so inspiring. But first, we have to start by how it all began. So
yeah, sure. Well, thank you for having me here. Listening through that bio, I think I like myself more than I did yesterday. But you say that I'm an extraordinary individual, and I really think the power of my message for everyone is I'm really not. I always wanted to be. I've done some extraordinary things, and I've overcome some extraordinary challenges. But quite honestly, if you hung out with me for a day or two, you'd realize I'm very, very ordinary. And if I can do it, you can too. So there's hope for us all.
yes,
And
but
yeah,
what
so
happened to you is really, it's like a miracle, really.
it
So
really is. As a matter of fact, for years, my website and even my profile on Instagram was called Swimming in Miracles. And I changed it because everybody thought that meant that I swam so far it was a miracle. But actually, it was all born from Einstein's quote that there are only two ways to live your life. One is as if nothing is a miracle. The other is as if everything's a miracle. And it sounds crazy, but for me, that's what started the whole thing off. And by looking at what seemingly, especially here in America, that is so against our cultural training, to look at everything as if it's a miracle, that it takes quite a commitment. But once you do, you start seeing miracles all around you every day. Even our bodies, we take our bodies so for granted, and there are millions of interactions that happen automatically every day just to get out of bed. And we haven't even begun, I think, to explore the beauty and the miraculous nature of our own human body.
I think we never will be able really to know how the, how the brain works exactly, and it's impossible. And that's the beauty of it. It really is a miracle.
I think that's a great point. I've never thought about that. Yeah, it's so miraculous and so overwhelmingly wonderful. We probably never will fully understand it. That's well said. Yeah, exactly. But it all starts with, I mean, my story, of course, doesn't start, but the miracle of overcoming cancer starts with hearing those terrible three words: you have cancer.
Answer. Yes. So tell us about
Yeah,
hearing this.
I grew up here in Oregon, the son of two mountain climbers, had just an idyllic childhood in many ways. And then all I ever wanted to be or do was I wanted to be a National Geographic sponsored adventurer. And when I lived here in Portland, a fairly large city in the northwest of Oregon, and it was an interesting childhood because two things were very different about my family. One, we spent most of our time out. Every moment we had that was free, we'd be in the wildest places up in the mountains, sometimes not seeing people for days. And I'd come back to school on Monday, and everybody would have been bored watching the Scooby-Doo marathon or something. And they'd ask me what I'd do. And I had just at age 10 or 11 climbed the tallest mountain in Oregon.
Wow.
And and so I was living very differently. The other reason is my parents, unlike most couples in the 60s, really adored each other. They just really loved each other. And it was inspiring to me constantly. As a matter of fact, that's all I ever wanted, was to fall in love and build a family and experience the kind of love that I saw between them. And I was confused many times when I'd see my friends' parents and they would hardly say hello to each other, or worse, be fairly conflictual. And I just hardly ever saw that as a kid. So that was my childhood. And
That's the
then
foundation.
football.
Definitely.
What's that?
That's the foundation. The
Oh
whole
yeah, it
story.
really is. It
Yeah.
really is. And as if people read my book, they find that those two wild adventurers have a big part to play unexpectedly in my healing journey as well.
Yeah, it became a family adventure, the whole thing.
It did. It
But
did.
let's go back to how it
But
started.
going back, uh, that's all I ever wanted to do, all I ever wanted to be. And but then football, or we call it soccer here in America, just captured my heart and mind. I just adored it. I saw it like very physical, very fast moving chess. It's a sport that's constantly evolving, and I loved it because coaches couldn't tell me what to do. I had to use my brain and watch the field, and then got to hit people. And back in the
Very on
70s,
top.
it kind of probably kept that kind of hard physical contact probably kept me out of trouble because I got to express it out there on the pitch. And but as I graduated from what we call high school over here and started to university, I had several scholarships all around the nation to play soccer. And I, on a lark, picked a small college in Kansas in the very center of the US because I knew Dorothy from Wizard of Oz had been there. And I'd never heard of anybody that had ever been there. And It has a lot of history about the Wild West. Dodge City is in Kansas. And I don't think I told you yet, I actually lived in Dodge City, Kansas for 3 years.
Wow.
That's where I started my teaching career. And I was actually happy to get out of Dodge. Um, so, but I went there just thinking I'd be there for a year, play soccer, get to look up some history of the old Wild West and really the very start of the Civil War. And I fell in love with a cute little Kansas farm girl and ended up, she told me, hey, you came out here. I'm close to my family. I didn't go out to Oregon. I'm not just going to blindly follow you out to Oregon just because that's where you're from. If you love me, you're going to have to live here. And I came back here and thought about it, and Oregon just didn't seem beautiful anymore without that cute little Kansas farm girl. So I told all my friends I was putting myself in exile for love. And that's essentially what I did. Uh, it's a good thing I'd given up the idea of being a mountain climber because I don't know if you know over there, but Kansas doesn't literally even have hills. It's just flat, and most of it doesn't have trees, rivers, lakes, anything that I grew up with. It's just
Wow.
got a whole lot of wheat.
Wow.
And so lived there for 33 years before I
Makes
came
me think
back.
of now that I know the how it goes, how the story goes, makes me think maybe you're saying a whole lot of wheat, maybe whole lot of glyphosate who contributed to your story and also
Oh,
your wife's.
I certainly agree. I absolutely agree because especially in the 60s and 70s, they were still spraying DDT and other things all over the wheat. Even up until I left in 2012, they would go through, especially in the spring, with a big truck and just fill the city with clouds of pesticide trying to kill mosquitoes. Wouldn't even warn us, would just spray it right over children in playgrounds. And at the time, I didn't even think of it
Yeah.
until my wife was sick and I had her out when she was sick, just trying to get some sun. And here comes a truck and a big cloud of pesticide. And it hit me then. Oh my gosh, we've been living like this for 30 years, just
Wow.
breathing in all these toxic wastes.
I think we all
And
were. There was no, we weren't aware.
right, right. And especially in that little town, there had been a big oil refinery and they polluted the one river they did have, and it gave out several harmful emissions. And my wife had what we thought was a real funny story until we started learning about how the pesticides did affect us and our bodies. Her uncle had a huge wheat farm down in Oklahoma, and there were even pictures of her. She and her cousin called it playing snowman. He would have them go out and hold flags starting at about age 5 or 6, hold flags to point the crop dusters in. The crop duster would come down and spray the fields and spray right over them. And they'd be white with DDT, just covered with DDT, just half an inch thick. And then they'd go play like they were snowmen for the rest of the day with
Wow.
that DDT all over their body. And we just thought that was the funniest thing until we started learning more. And then it wasn't funny.
No.
But that's the kind of lack of education and lack of knowledge we had. And in this tiny little town of 12,000, the percentages of cancer were just astronomical. When I left, I was one of there were only 12,000 people in this tiny little rural town. And there were probably, I think I was one of about 27 who had blood cancer, leukemia. And then she was the 13th person in the last 5 years who died of a brain tumor.
Wow.
And there were 15 who had Parkinson's. And it was just rampant. The percentages were so high, and looking back on it now, I just think there was just so much pollutant in the water table and just in the air all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Terrible.
Right.
So it also connects to how you healed eventually,
Right.
because what you did, the ultimate cleanse. But let's go back to what happened. So how?
Yeah, it all started. My first diagnosis was in 2006, 4 days before Christmas, and playing so much soccer, I had my senior year of college really gotten in a terrible soccer injury. I'd gone in for a slide tackle, and a guy had fallen on my leg, and I came up over him and my leg and totally bent it, hyperextended it backwards, and tore all the ligaments and dislocated the kneecap and done all sorts of terrible things. Had several surgeries and was waiting for a total knee replacement, but I was so young, they wouldn't let me have a knee replacement till I was in my 40s. And so in 2007, they finally had a knee that they had developed, a titanium knee that would last me probably the rest of my life. And it had parts that you could take out and fit in arthroscopically. And so it was time to get my knee replaced. And I had been waiting for 20 years for this. And so I went in for a pre-surgical blood test. And I had been a teacher. I was a teacher first in this small town for 20 years. And then about 5, 6 years into teaching, I saw that there were so many problems with these children and their parents and the other teachers. Everybody was hurting so badly. It made me want to become a therapist. And so I started going back to school at night. And for 13 years, I did both. And both was a teacher at day and then a therapist at night, building my private practice. But anyway, because I'd been a teacher there so long, this was now, I had been out of teaching for 5 years. And most of the kids at 11, I taught sixth grade, 11 and 12-year-olds. Most of those students that I taught had grown up and were taking entry-level jobs. Well, the person who drew my blood had been a student, a sweet girl. And so when they called me and said, Dean, your blood test came back bad, it never occurred to me that there was something wrong with me. I thought this poor little girl had fouled my blood test, done something wrong. And so I told the nurse, I said, oh, well, don't get anybody in trouble. It's okay. I'll just come back in. She said, what? And I said, huh? And she says, no, come back in. I said, well, okay, just make sure no one's in trouble. And she said, yeah, oh, okay, just come back in. And so I went in, and another student who I had in school drew my blood, and I said, boy, I hope Marissa, this girl, isn't in trouble. And she says, well, why would she be in trouble? And I said, well, the blood test came back bad. And she kind of looked at me funny, and she said, oh, okay. And she said, no, Marissa's fine. And bless her heart, she didn't want to tell me it was me. I still didn't clue, and they took several vials of blood, and it still didn't occur to me that something was wrong with me. And then that night, my doctor, who had become just one of my closest friends, Dr. Aaron Waters, met me at my office at about 10 p.m. And this wasn't unusual because he was chief of staff and he had a lot of stress. And so, and I'm a clinical hypnotherapist and meditation teacher. And so I would have him come in and get him down into a state of hypnosis and help him de-stress, and do that a couple times a month after work. And so he came in and I just thought that's what was happening. And I said, "Hey, Aaron, how can I help you?" He said, "Dean, it's not how you can help me. It's what I need to tell you." And I thought, oh no, he's in trouble. maybe he's being sued for malpractice or something. So I was alarmed. And we sat down in my office and he said, "Dean, your blood test came back bad." And again, I said, "Oh, yeah, I know, but it's okay. Don't get anybody in trouble." And he says, "No, that's not it at all." He said, "You have cancer." And I said, "What?" He says, "Yeah, you've got leukemia and it's really awful." He said, I've sent it off to seven top oncologists, and none of us have ever seen anything like it. You've got features of both acute and chronic, and it's escalating by hundreds of thousands every day. He said, "This is really very, very life-threatening." I wasn't really getting it. It wasn't, the news was not landing. I was in shock. And he said, "Dean, if things don't change, you probably only have 4 to 6 weeks to live." And that's when it hit like the crash of a hammer. Because at that time, my daughter, who I just adore, it was 14 years old. And I don't know if you've hung around 14-year-old girls lately, but they need their dads. At least I believe so. And so it was just devastating. And I was very, very sick for about a year. Um, just my immune system was so suppressed that it just made it difficult to get out of bed or to walk down the hallway or down the street. I just had no energy whatsoever. And so I mostly just slept on the couch. When I could, I'd get up and I'd go to work. I'd call my clients and say, "Hey, I'm fine today. I'll see you." And then I just struggle through trying to listen to their problems. Thankfully, I should tell you, after a couple of weeks, it settled down and it went totally into chronic lymphocytic leukemia, which doesn't kill you quickly. It usually acts like an autoimmune disorder and slowly ramps up and finally does kill you at some point. But it bought us time. But I think the shock of being sick for the first time in my life is really what made me so terribly sick that first. Anyway, so that was the first experience that we had with cancer. And I was 47 years old at that time. And I was pretty sick for a year, but then I came back and I was doing pretty well. And part of coming back to life was I knew I had to have a purpose, something to think about. And so every moment that I could, I started writing my first book. And it was to help young girls find out how to prevent date rape, because so much of my work had been with sexual trauma. And I wanted to get on the front side and teach young women how to watch out, because we teach them about strangers, but most rape here in America especially is from people they know, boyfriends, teachers, youth pastors, people they know and trust, and family members. And I wanted them to know what to look for. And so I worked really hard anytime that I had to work on this book, and it gave me something really positive to think about. And it turned out pretty well. It started doing well, and gave me something to live for besides just my family. And of course, that would have been enough. And so by 2008, I was doing well. However, my immune system was still suppressed. And I changed a few things, but not quite enough things. And as I started to get better, I did what most cancer survivors do. I kind of got a little lazy and started eating a lot of sugar again, started not sleeping as much. It just didn't take as good a care of myself as I needed to, like I did when I was trying to recover.
You're a therapist at heart. You put yourself last. That's what we
Right,
do.
right, right.
The problem.
Yeah, and I wasn't having enough real, what's the word I'm looking for? Respect for how much every day, all day, hearing the worst sexual trauma stories of rape and molestation and even incest. I wasn't having enough respect for how much trauma I was incurring, secondhand trauma, and what it was doing to my body.
Right.
And so, yeah, I was seriously putting myself last. And so in June of 2008, I got pneumonia, and my immune system was so suppressed, I almost died for the first time. I woke up, and Dr. Waters was standing over me looking in an IV, and I said, "Hey," and he says, "Oh, you're awake. Good." And I said, "How are you doing?" And he said, "It's not how I'm doing, it's how you're doing." And I said, "Well, how am I doing?" And he said, "You almost didn't make it." I said, "Oh, wow, okay." He said, "You need to really fight this thing. You need to give it your all. You need to come back." I said, "Oh, I can do that." And so I did, and it wasn't easy. It took about 2 months of really struggling to get well again. But I did finally. And then 2009 and most of 2010 was wonderful. Got back to life. The book started really doing well. I started going around talking to groups of young girls at different schools and colleges were starting to notice. And Kansas State was talking to me at the time about buying a book for each freshman girl that came in so that they'd be safe. And so I thought, wow, this is real. My life is really taking off, and that cancer scare is going to be a distant memory.
Little did you
Little
know.
did I know for sure. Yeah. Um, almost just a week or two after I thought that, my wife got sick, and we thought she had pneumonia at first. It's not unusual for people to get pneumonia in the summer there because there's so much wheat dust in the air and pesticides, and it's so hot. And so most of us aren't getting out as much. So we're staying inside in the air conditioning and not being as active. And she got sick, and that was very unusual to see her laying around because she was just a dynamo. She only had two speeds, extremely fast and asleep. There was no in between for my first wife, Mary. And so to see her for the first time in 30 years kind of lay on the couch too, I thought, wow, it must have been hard for her to see me do that for a year because I'm struggling to watch her do that for just a couple of weeks. And then her face on the right side fell. And we thought, well, that's not pneumonia. So I took her in, and they thought she had something called Meniere's disease. But then she started garbling her speech and not really thinking clearly. And so we took her in for a brain scan. And lo and behold, they found the largest brain tumor they'd ever, the neurosurgeon said he'd seen. And brain surgery and brain tumors are operable the higher in the brain they are and the farther forward they are. And hers was all the way back and down around her brainstem with several fingers. And he said, even with laser guided surgery, this was back in 2010, maybe they're better now, I don't know. But even with laser guided surgery, there was over an 80% chance they'd nick a blood vessel and she'd bleed out on the table, or they'd nick a nerve and she'd become a quadriplegic. But I said, even if it went perfectly, they'd probably only be able to get 50% of the tumor. And so I asked, well, let's say it went perfectly and you got 50% of the tumor and she didn't bleed out and she didn't become paralyzed. Would she come back to life like I did? And he said, no, probably not. It'd just buy her time. And I said, well, how much time? And he said, probably only about 6 months. And she'd have to have massive amounts of chemo and radiation. And I said, well, what would her quality of life be like? And he said, well, imagine having a terrible case of the flu and a migraine all at the same time. And I said, well, that's no way to live. I can't put her through that. And I said, what if we don't do anything? And he said, well, the brain tumor will continue to grow and it looks like it's growing rapidly. And so she'll just sleep more, lose her abilities more, and then she'll die in her sleep. And I asked him, what will she be in a lot of pain? What will that experience be like for her? And he said, well, as best he could guess, there wouldn't be a lot of pain. She'd just kind of wither away. And so I said, okay, well, that's what we'll do. And that's sadly what we did. And he said at the most she had 6 months, but from that day, September 2nd, 2010, she only had 52 days. Wow. She died then October 30th of 2010. Yeah. And it was absolutely devastating. The ironic thing is I'd been considered a grief expert in the Midwest. I led seminars on grief. I'd written articles in magazines and newspapers about grief and the grief process. But when my wife died, she died 15 days before our 30th anniversary. Wow. And so literally we had grown up together, I felt like, because when I married her, I wasn't even 21 yet. I was just, looking back, I was just a baby. I tell everybody I was 21 going on 12. I was such a kid. Yeah. And we had lived our entire time, as she had asked or demanded, in her small town. Well, this town is such a tiny, isolated rural community that if your grandparents didn't grow up there, you're considered an outsider. So even after 30 years of living there, people still called me Mary's husband. They didn't call me by my name. I mean, sometimes they did, but most of the time, oh, there's Mary's husband. And it was a good gig. But what I hadn't realized is by hearing that as my name throughout my whole adult life, it had insidiously created my adult identity. Yeah. And so now that I wasn't Mary's husband, who am I? Yeah. And so I was so devastated. And to know the exact process of grief, but then to be so powerless to do anything to change it, it was just a horrible experience. It was so intense. I'd never really cried before my wife died, except for when my daughter was born. And those were tears of joy and overwhelming just how beautiful life can be. And that was an odd experience for me. But after my wife died, I couldn't talk about the weather without crying. I couldn't say her name. Her name was Mary. I couldn't say that without just breaking down and bawling. It had to be so out of control with my emotions shocked me, because I imagined, you always, when you live with somebody that long, And you imagine what would it be like if they died? And having dealt with it with so many folks and watched them go through the process, I kind of assumed I knew how I'd be, and I knew I'd be terribly sad, but I thought I'd be so strong. And I wasn't at all. As a matter of fact, I was so broken that I even called up several of my old clients and apologized. I said, I thought I knew, I thought I was helping you. I have to apologize. I don't think I knew at all. And they were all really kind. They let me off the hook. But it was just devastating. And I really don't even remember the rest of tooth. Every now and then when people I know, old friends, will say, oh, remember this. If they talk about it enough, the memory comes back. Sometimes it doesn't at all. And now that it's been almost 15 years, I've retrieved a lot of 2010 to 2013. But at the time, uh, it was just a big blank, a big void. I wouldn't remember one day to the next. It was just this very disconnected, very flat, very jagged existence that I had never experienced. And as is true now with trauma, we're finding that, especially for a lot of chronic illness and blood cancers, that usually right around the 1 year date of the trauma, there is a diagnosis. Yes. And nearly 1 year to the day, the cancer, the leukemia came back with a vengeance and brought with it this time lymphoma, non-Hodgkin small cell lymphoma. And it just racked my body. And so I really didn't care that much. My daughter had gone to university. She was doing fairly well. I mean, at least in her grades, and which always surprised me. But I just couldn't live in this little town anymore. Every place I went, every person I met reminded me of Mary. And she had decorated, of course, our house. And so every little thing in our house had her touch. And so I sold the house, sold my practice, and moved back home to Oregon.
Wow.
And thinking that that would help, because at least I'd be close to my family and back in the beauty. But I hadn't realized, oh, all my adult friends were back there in Kansas. So I gave all them up pretty much, really isolated myself even more. And as is true of most men of my generation, so much of my identity was formed and knitted by being a therapist.
Yeah.
And now I wasn't.
Yeah.
And also, having taught for so many years, everybody that was under 30 called me Mr. Hall. And one of the funny things is anytime I went to a restaurant or a fast food place, I loved my students so much, and most of them cared for me. They would comp me the meal, or at least the French fries or something. And that was the one thing my daughter knows. She's like, wow, you're having to buy your own meals now. So it was just very strange to all of a sudden have no friends, have no real identity, have nobody knowing me,
and nothing to do.
Being a stranger.
And nothing to do because your clinic is gone.
Right, right. And I see it now as a real godsend, a gift. But at the time, it was very frustrating. I came to Oregon, and here in the States, each state has its own licensure practice. And so when you go from one state to another, you have to get licensed again. And Kansas wasn't talking to Oregon, and the rules were very different. And so I was seeing students fresh out of university getting their license easier, more quickly than me. And I brought it to the attention of the government, even in Oregon, and they noticed, oh, this isn't fair, this isn't right. We should be welcoming seasoned professionals into our state. And so they changed the laws here in Oregon for me and a couple others. And I was so happy when they told me they'd do that, but I had no idea how slow the government moves. It took 18 months, so a year and a half. I went almost 2 years with nothing to do. And so I rented a nice little duplex over by my family where my mom and dad lived. But then to be renting for the first time, I just lost everything.
Yes. So this is rock bottom. You hit rock bottom.
Right. Rock bottom for me was alone and broke. I had worked very hard all my life. As a matter of fact, I had 2 jobs up until the time I was 42, from the time I was 15 to the time I was 42, and saved and saved. And, the American dream is to pile up a mountain of money and then quit and just play golf, which makes no sense to me. But we had done everything to be responsible, and it was finally paying off. We had a beautiful house. We had nice cars. We had more money than we needed. We were planning on doing a lot of traveling. And then she died. And then I got very sick. And one of the things I didn't tell you is to try to prove to my daughter that I was still strong. In 2012, before we moved back to Oregon while she was home from university, I swam a mile across a lake in Oklahoma to prove to her that I was strong, because she was getting very scared because I was losing weight and the lymph nodes were growing and starting to disfigure my face. And I didn't want her to worry, so I thought I'd show her how strong I was, not knowing that I was swimming through blue-green algae, and the blue-green algae went up my nose, went through the semi-permeable membrane, and a day and a half later, I collapsed. Wow. And had viral meningitis and was in a coma for 2.5 days. And they didn't think I would live. And so there, my poor daughter, all alone, takes her dad. She's terrified that her dad's dying now too, and he almost did. And I woke up, and when I woke up, I literally, I'd never really felt sorry for myself, but that's when I started to compare myself to Job, the man in the Old Testament, who everything went wrong, because there's one place in Job where he's sitting on an ash heap and he's lost everything and he's picking at his scabs. And when I looked in the mirror after I woke up, I didn't recognize myself because my fever had been so high, and I'd been out, and I hadn't looked in the mirror for about 6-7 days. And in that 6 or 7 days, I'd lost 60 pounds because I hadn't been eating, of course. And my fever had been so high, it just melted the fat right off my body and everything else practically. And so I'd gone from 212 or 220 to 160, but then wasted away even more down to 152 pounds, and I'm 6'1". And so I just looked skeletal. But what really scared me more than anything is my lymph nodes had grown even more. Probably they hadn't grown that much. I just lost so much weight, you could see them more. They protruded more. But I had scabs all over my face and my whole body, even on my tongue. I'm like, how do you get scabs on your tongue? It was so ugly, almost monstrous. It looked like from something from a scary movie. And I just thought, how did I end up here? And then 2 days later, when it was time to leave the hospital, they told me that my insurance wasn't very good and that I owed them $500,000 out of pocket. And that if I went and canceled my insurance, I come back and they give me a 50% discount if I paid cash.
Wow.
And so I did. And I wrote them a check for 200 some $1,000. And so now I was pretty much broke. So I'd lost everything. They were sure I'd got it from the blue-green algae, which probably would make it viral, but it could be herpetic. The problem is if it was herpetic, they told me that it would continue to eat away at my brain. And within a year or two, I would only have a 10-second memory. And that was the hardest part of this whole journey, laying there so sick that I couldn't even get up, felt my brain so swollen, I couldn't read. I woke up and I don't even remember learning how to read. I was reading so early, like at 3 or 4 years old. I just kind of picked it up, but I couldn't read because my brain was so swollen, it wasn't working correctly. And so I was laying there thinking these kind of fractured thoughts, wondering I'd lost my wife, I'd lost my money, I'd lost my health. And now the one thing I'd always kind of depended on, my brain, I'm going to lose my mind. And I had to sit with that for 3 or 4 days before the results came back. Thankfully, I've never been so happy in my life to have viral meningitis. I was so thankful. I just cried tears of joy, knowing that my brain would come back. And it took 6 months. I had a hard time even walking at first because my head hurt and I was so dizzy and off balance. And my immune system was so bad that I was so weak and so tired that I remember getting hiking poles just to walk down the hallway.
Wow.
And then, I'd done a lot of triathlons and climbed mountains as a kid. I had this real good part of myself where I could make myself go farther, longer than anybody else. I call it the endurance muscle. And I'd learned to crawl back in my brain and just make my body go the extra mile. And I remember having to use that to walk just one lap around the track with my hiking poles. And I was so excited and proud of myself for getting one time around the track. But yeah, it took me about 6 months to regain any kind of strength or health. And at the end of that 6 months, I moved to Oregon. So that kind of sets the stage for all of your viewers how really low life brought me. Yeah.
So and then you moved to Oregon, and what made you decide that your next step is going to be what you did?
Yeah. I wish I could say that, boy, I just came back and I was so strong and didn't feel sorry for myself at all. But that's not what happened. That's why many times when kind people like you say I'm extraordinary, I always think, well, they don't know the whole story and they didn't see a lot of what I said or did when I was at my worst.
I read the book.
Yes, you did. So, but for 2 years, or really a year and a half, from 2012 to August of 2013, I just kind of sat in this dark little duplex feeling sorry for myself, crying a lot. I had really disordered sleep. I was having nightmares, 6 to 8 nightmares just about every night about Mary dying, losing Mary, what happened afterwards. And of course, as dreams are, they became very nightmarish, very monstrous. And I'd wake up really scared and many times just never able to go back to sleep. So I wasn't sleeping much. I wasn't eating well. I just kind of given up by August of 2013. And one day I got up and I went to the bathroom, and I'd made a practice ever since viral meningitis of never looking in the mirror, because when I looked in the mirror, it didn't look like me. And I never have considered myself good looking. I was really ugly. I was so ugly, it was embarrassing. I just looked deformed, I thought, because my lymph nodes had gotten so big and I had lost so much weight. My eyes were so sunken, and I just looked so sad. And so one day in August of 2013, I walked in and I accidentally looked in the mirror. And that man looked so scary. He was so ashen and white, and he had red rimmed eyes and dark circles, and he was just painfully thin. And I remember blurting out, and this is what started the change. Oh my gosh, you look like you just came out of Auschwitz. And then I thought of what I consider my old friend, Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, you probably know better than I, was an Austrian psychiatrist, sadly, right at the start of World War II. And he was taken to Auschwitz, and he watched people, and he had a hypothesis as to what it took to overcome great challenges, but he found that it wasn't what he thought at all. It wasn't about physical strength or prowess at all. It was mostly how passionately you were tied to a purpose. And I'd used his book hundreds of times in my practice with people that were trying to overcome big challenges, to help them learn to become passionate about a purpose. And every time I could get a client to do that, no matter what it was, they got better. So I knew how being passionate about a purpose could bring you back to life. And when I looked at that man, I knew two things. Number one, I hadn't been to Auschwitz. And Viktor Frankl had been through more than I'd been through. And so I thought, well, if Viktor could do it, I could do it too, especially if I did what he did. The second thing I thought was I was starting to feel so sorry for myself that when I looked in the mirror, I thought, if I just quit trying and didn't do anything, the leukemia would take me, and I'm done. I've accomplished everything I wanted to. I'd written a book. I'd taught many children and hopefully had helped their lives be a little better. I had helped thousands of clients. I had been in love and had a good marriage. I raised a wonderful daughter. I'm done. But then I realized, well, that's an entirely selfish thought. She just lost one parent. She doesn't need to lose two. I need to do whatever I can to bring myself back to health. And so that's when I decided I had to do what I'd encouraged so many hundreds of other people to do. I reread Viktor Frankl's book. I had to have a passionate purpose.
Yes.
And there wasn't anything I was passionate about. As a matter of fact, I wasn't even passionate about myself or my life, and not even very thankful for all the good things that had happened in my life because they seemed so distant. But what I did know is the brain by its very nature has to answer every question you ask. And what I'd learned is that's true with even the deepest questions of your life, not just trivia. And so when people were in my position, what I'd have them do is get into a time of meditation or prayer and just concentrate and ask, how could I be passionate? What could I be passionate about that would really bring me back to life? And just concentrate on it, let it go. Do that several times a day. Typically, people within 3 or 4, at the most 10 to 14 days, something will come to them.
Yes.
Well, 4 to 6 weeks later, I'm still waiting. And I remember this one day, I'm praying passionately with all my heart and mind. And it's been about 6 weeks. And I'm just almost mad at God and at life because it's crickets. There's nothing. And I look up, and I'd been living in this little duplex for almost a year, about 6, 8 months. And I'd been so depressed, I hadn't even unpacked. As a matter of fact, I hadn't even put my bed together. I was living on a mattress on the floor. And I thought, okay, well, while you're waiting for the universe or God to answer, Dean, maybe you could act like a responsible adult and at least unpack and put your bed together. So I put my bed together and I started to unpack. And one of the first boxes I unpacked was a box of my childhood things that my mother had taken out of her house and wanted me to have. And there was a journal I'd been forced to keep when I was 11 years old. So I thought, oh, let's see what the 11-year-old Dean had to say. And so I opened it up, and the very first page, it said, when I get old, I gotta climb Mount Everest, swim the English Channel.
Wow.
And I still get chills every time. And an electric shock just went through me. I'd forgotten that wild boy that I had been, who just wanted to be outdoors, who had climbed mountains and swam across alpine lakes and laughed in forests and just hated being indoors in school and just wanted to be outside, kind of almost like a wild animal. And I thought, that's what I need to do. But I knew very quickly that there's no way I could climb Everest because my immune system was so bad, my blood counts were bad, it probably wouldn't handle elevation. And I didn't have any money, and I knew it'd probably cost me $6,000 to $7,000 to get there and climb it. But I had forgotten. I don't know. Maybe it's because my brain still wasn't working. Only a year and a half later, I had forgotten that I'd almost died from swimming across that lake.
Yeah.
But immediately I thought, I can swim the channel. And so I immediately Googled active cancer patient who swam the English Channel, and nobody had. So I thought I could be the first person in history. And that got me really excited. So I called up my friend, Dr. Aaron Waters, to tell him what I was going to do, because anytime I decided to do anything, he was kind of still overseeing my recovery.
I have to tell you that his name, Waters, I told you once before, it's so amazing to me because your whole story is about Waters. So it's so funny.
Yeah, it's so funny. I've thought about you and that's such a gift you've given me, because he'd been my friend since 2001. And we'd gotten so close through my diagnosis. He brought me back to life from almost dying from pneumonia.
Yeah, he's a huge part of your book. That's why I thought you made this name up.
Yeah, I hadn't, until I wrote the book, and started talking about it, I hadn't realized he'd been such a good friend, but he'd been there for every key moment of my life.
Yes.
And it
And you
never
for
occurred to
him,
me that,
obviously you for him, because he was coming to you when he was stressed.
right. And since his name is spelled Watters, it never occurred to me that it was water. So
Yeah,
it's
need
so
someone from the
ironic and
outside
beautiful.
to see it. Yeah.
Right. Well, and you're the first in over 300 podcasters that ever put that together. And I don't know how many thousands and thousands of people have read my book. Nobody's ever said that. I've got 159,000 followers on Instagram. Nobody's ever said that.
That's
So
so
you are
funny.
really extraordinary.
Yeah.
You're the one.
Okay.
But that was such a wonderful gift. So thank you.
Mm.
But anyway, Dr. Watters, I call him up and tell him, and he just was incredulous. He didn't know how to respond. He said, Dean, not only no, but hell no. What are you thinking? And he reminded me I'd almost died a year earlier, and I hadn't thought about it. I'm like, oh, yeah, I'd forgotten. He's like, how did you forget that? He said, well, please, it's going to make you look kind of dorky, but if you're going to do this thing, at least wear a nose plug like the little kids do, because the viral meningitis the blue-green algae went up your nose. He's like, you get in a public pool, your immune system's so bad, I'm afraid that'll kill you. At least make sure the water doesn't get up your nose. And then as soon as you get out of the pool, scrub your whole body down, make sure that, you keep yourself as clean as you possibly can. I said, okay, I'll do that. And so that next day, I went to the public pool and I did my first laps. And I only did 11 laps. And the reason I did 11 was the English Channel is usually, depending on the currents and how you catch them, about 20 miles. Well, I knew I didn't have 20 laps in me. I wanted to do something symbolic. So a lap is 2 lengths. So I did 10 laps, which would be 20 lengths. And my dad, ever since I was a little kid, he'd push us to the end of our endurance, and then he'd make us do just a little bit more. Yeah. And so I got to 10, and I heard my dad say, okay, do one more. And so I did. Usually 11 laps would take me 9 minutes, maybe, if that. It took me over an hour because I do one length, barely get to the side of the pool, and just hang on and breathe for a few minutes. But it was glorious, right? I just, for the first time since my wife died, felt like myself again, because I was swimming and I'd done so many hundreds of laps. I did a lot of triathlon through the 80s and 90s, and it felt like me. And so every day I'd go back and try to do one more lap. And within a couple months, all my blood counts were going in the right direction. I was gaining weight. My head was starting to clear. I was sleeping a little better. I was still having about 3 to 5 nightmares a night instead of 6 to 8. I was still crying a lot. But that was one of the things I liked about swimming. When you've got your face down in the water and your goggles on, nobody knows if you're crying. And if you get out and your eyes are all red and puffy and there's water, they just think it's from the pool.
Yeah.
Right. And so it kind of gave me a pass. And by about November, December, I feel like I'm getting fit again and my head's clearing. I notice I'm thinking more clearly. And one day I got out of the pool right around Christmas. Gosh, it would have been almost 11, 12 years ago today. And the thought occurred to me, who cares if another middle-aged man puts on a Speedo and swims to France? It does the world no good. And in my case, it's not going to be a pretty picture. So I thought, okay, what would do the world more good? What could I do that would inspire other cancer patients even more because everybody swims the channel. What could I do that might be a little more challenging even than that? And so I used that same process of praying and asking the question, letting it go. Within just a couple days, I remembered an ancient dream that I'd had 30 years earlier. I'd come out for a bicycle race. I'd done really well for me. There were 600 in the race, and I ended up like 15th. And, you know, I wasn't on the podium, but I did way better than I thought I would. And my family, being my family, they threw me a huge celebration picnic. And it was on the banks of the Willamette River at a park. And the Willamette River growing up in the 60s and 70s had been terribly polluted. It was just an oil slick. And in the 70s, my state put a lot of environmental protection laws and policies in place. And before it had cleaned up, I'd gone to Kansas, really never been back. All of a sudden, I'm on the banks of this river that I had been born only 4 blocks away from. It's such, I call it the mother of our state because it starts up in the mountains. It's the longest river in Oregon. It's 187 miles long. It's wide, it's big, and it comes down through our 2 main college towns, through both the university cities. Then it comes through our state capital, and then it feeds the whole Willamette Valley, which is the farmland and where all the vineyards, the famous vineyards are. And then it comes through our largest city, Portland, and dumps into one of the world's largest rivers, the Columbia. And so it just kind of essentially feeds and dynamically is what our whole state is about. But it's a river, so everybody kind of ignores it, doesn't really even think about it. Even though there are 11 bridges crossing it just in Portland to get from the east side to the west side in our city. Everybody crosses it every day, but doesn't think about it. But here, this river that I had been born by had become healthy. It was blue and clear and clean, and you could see fish, and there were waterfowl. And I just was mesmerized by it. And so my dad, being what I call the great adventurer, he climbed all the mountains on the West Coast, some many times. The highest mountain in Oregon, he'd climbed 40 or 50 times. He'd run most of the world's major marathons. He'd run the Boston, New York, London, Copenhagen. And so I always really respected him and wanted to be like him. And so I was trying to impress him. I looked at him and I said, "Hey, has anyone ever swum this whole thing?" And he looked at me and I thought he'd say, "Wow, that's my boy. I love you." He did the exact opposite. He was like, "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Where do you come up with this crap?" Well, it shocked me so much, it made me a little mad. And that just kind of set the hook. It was almost like a dare.
Yeah.
It was like, okay, now I have to do it to prove him wrong. And so I started poring over maps, and I became really excited about swimming this whole length of this river and becoming the first person in history to do so. And then I went home to Mary to Kansas. And, you know, she'd never grown up by rivers. And I told her, "Hey, this is what I'm going to do." And that was just so far away from her world. She was confused. And she said, "So how long is it going to take you?" And I said, "Well, it's 187 miles long. It'll probably take me about 3 weeks. That's especially if everything goes right and I swim about 10 miles a day, which to the triathlon world is a little over 3 marathons." And she's like, "Okay, why?" And I said, "Well, it'd be a world record and I'd be the first person in history to accomplish this." And she said, "Well, how long would you have to take off of work?" And I said, "Well, probably for three weeks, maybe 4." she said, how are we going to pay our bills? And I said, oh, I hadn't thought of that. We'd probably have to use our savings. And she said, you're going to drain our savings when we're trying to buy a house to swim a river. It makes no sense. Be a responsible adult. so, and so I said, oh, you're right. And so in the name of being a responsible adult, I gave up this big dream. But 30 years later, it came back to me. And so that's what I decided to do. And I thought, if I can swim as an active cancer patient, 187 miles, then it will inspire other cancer patients to refuse to be defined by their diagnosis. And so that I felt would do the world some good. And it got me really excited. And so that's what I did. In June of 2014, I stepped in the river. It took me 22 days, but I took every Sunday off to let my body rest, but mostly to remind myself that I could even accomplish a world record without having to be perfect. Because all my adult life, I've struggled with perfectionism and feeling like I have to do everything just right. And so I would rest every Sunday. And I averaged 10 to 12 miles a day in 40-degree water. And that was the hardest. It's largely a snow melt river. And we'd had a lot of snow that year. And so it usually is the high 40s, low 50s. In June, it was 42 to 45 for the first 16 days I swam. And even with a 3 mil triathlon wetsuit, I was going into fairly deep hypothermia. Wow. I could feel my internal organs shaking against my rib cage after about 30, 45 minutes. And so I get out, have to run in place or do jumping jacks on the river bank and drink some hot tea, eat as much as I could without throwing up, and then get back in and do it again. And this is in 2014. I'd never heard of cold water immersion. Exactly. I wasn't on Instagram. There wasn't, I think there was Instagram, but I didn't know about it. I'd never heard of Wim Hof. I didn't know that being cold was good. As a matter of fact, I was afraid, and my oncologist was afraid, that this marathon event in this kind of cold water would stress my body so much that it might possibly kill me. Yeah. But for me, that was a life well spent. I would die swinging for the fence. I would die trying to do something courageous, not just sit there watching TV on a couch. I didn't want to go out watching Wheel of Fortune. So we had chemo and radiation planned for right after the swim was over. Because he didn't want to do it before. Yeah. Because he knew it would make me weak, and I didn't want to do it before either. So we put it off till after the swim. And then the first blood test I took after the swim, miraculously, we found the leukemia was gone.
Amazing. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. So it wasn't intentional. You didn't go, you weren't planning on curing yourself with these cold plunges. You were just swimming for the purpose of, showing other cancer patients. And the result was you cured yourself.
Right,
of
right.
Leukemia.
And I don't feel like I cured myself. I feel like nature cured me. Yeah. And before that, I'd read a little bit of research about how nature is helpful in healing, but I hadn't done much with it. It was still in the early stages of a field called ecotherapy. And I really had, even though I'd had good parents who taught me how to respect nature, I had adopted kind of their philosophy and their viewpoint of nature, that it's there for our recreation. I hadn't seen nature as equal or even maybe greater than me. I'd been raised in that kind of puritanical thought that I'm man, I'm the pinnacle of nature, I'm in dominion over nature. And that's one of the coolest parts of my story, the saga and the transformation that happened fairly quickly as I got more and more connected to the river. When I got in on June 3rd, 2014, it was simply the Willamette River. I was going to use it as kind of a big blue highway all the way north. After a few days, I had kind of gotten so used to swimming in the flow of it and almost in this dance with it, I started calling it Big Blue. After 2 weeks, I started feeling so connected to the river that, as crazy as it sounds, I started getting impressions almost like it was talking or whispering to me, very comforting things, like a sweet mother would do as she rocked her child in her arms. Wow. And when I'd get in, you know, when you're swimming in a river, it's moving. And so it's not like swimming in a pool. It literally is kind of rocking you and moving you. And so I felt kind of cradled. And so I started calling it Mama River. And even by the time we got to day 16, I noticed my crusty old father, because that was one of the miraculous things that happened. In order to swim a river, you have to have a guide boater in front of you, a kayaker, to find the right lines and to warn you of danger, because you can see about 10 yards ahead and about a quarter of a mile, but you can't see danger about 50 yards ahead. And so you need somebody up above the water seeing that, or, you know, when you get in more populated areas, warning boats that there's a swimmer in the river. And I had 5 kayakers, good, young, fit kayakers, in front of me and all planned. And we were going to start practicing together. And right before we started practicing in April, 4 out of the 5 dropped out. And so my dad had been helping me plan the stages of this swim. And so I went to him and told him, and he called me the next day and he said, "Hey, I think I got the answer." And I said, "Oh, really? You know somebody?" He's like, "No, I'm going to do it." And I'm like, "Oh, you're going to take one of the legs?" He's like, "No, I'm going to do the whole thing." And I said, "Dad, there's a problem with that." I don't see a problem. "What's the problem?" I said, "Problem is you're 79 years old." 79. He's like, "Not a problem. I can do it." I said, "Dad, you've never been in a kayak." "I'll learn." And so during our practice swims for 2 months before we started, from April till June, we'd get in and we'd swim sections of the river, and he'd learn. And we got 2 expert kayakers to teach him how to read currents and what to watch out for. And he got used to doing it. And, you know, I just believe that when you become, like Viktor Frankl said, when you become passionate about a purpose, it does miraculous things. Yeah. And I had hoped for miraculous healing and a reason to overcome. But I believe that when you follow the big dream that you have inside of you, and I've worked with so many hundreds since, I believe we all have a dream in us that is uniquely ours. Like a goose flying south for the winter. Shira's dream is not Dean's dream, and Dean's dream isn't Shira's dream. But if we both follow our dreams, and this goes for everybody on earth, if we follow our dreams, miracles happen. You meet the people you need to meet, you do the things you need to do, you get in the places you need to be who you were created to be.
Yeah.
And when you truly are who you were created to be, I believe you naturally are in a position, the best position to heal. And one of the miracles that I wasn't intentional and I never guessed is my mom and dad joined me on this crazy adventure, and I got to spend 22 days, 3 weeks, 24/7 with my dad on the river. And it was so wonderful and such a gift to spend that time, because we'd done several things together and we'd even backpacked 3 or 4 days together, but not weeks on end.
Yeah.
And it had always kind of been a little young buck, old buck kind of button heads. And we just learned on a very intimate level who each other was, because he hadn't really seen me much since I was 18 years old. So he had to become acquainted with the adult man that I'd become. And so he learned some things about me and my strength as well. And I learned things. I'd always seen him as strong, but I learned things about his kindness and his softness. One of the things that happened that was really healing for me is he would get the kayak on the side, when I was freezing, and he became almost like my personal valet. He'd put a blanket around me. He'd fix me a hot cup of tea. He'd put a wool cap on my head, and he'd always been a good dad, but he'd never served me like that. And so it really changed the whole dynamic of our relationship. It was
like a
one of the
boxer,
greatest
a
gifts.
boxer in the ring, that he has his coach that's like
Yeah, his manager,
coaching.
his trainer. Yeah. And that's exactly the way it was. He was constantly, when I'd get tired, he was making decisions for me, or cheering me on. It was just sweet and beautiful.
Beautiful.
It was one of the best experiences of my life. Yeah. Yeah.
We're running a little late, but you
Yeah.
have to tell the audience about the remaining of, you were cured from the leukemia, but you still had the lymphoma. So what
Right.
happened next?
Right. We thought, my oncologist, who was considered the world's #3 in chronic lymphocytic leukemia, he was down at University of San Diego in California, Dr. Juanerio Castro. We both thought that now that the leukemia is gone, my body would easily shed the lymphoma. But the exact opposite happened. The lymphoma got very aggressive. They swelled up even more. The numbers went very badly. And so I was at a point again where I needed to do chemo and radiation. And I just didn't want to, because I'd had so many clients that had done chemo and radiation. And even when they'd successfully gone into remission, they had so many long-term side effects, mostly with their brain. And after viral meningitis, I didn't want to do anything with my brain. And so I said, hey, I'm going to search. The nature healed my leukemia. Nature probably also has the power to heal my lymphoma. And he's such a kind man. He didn't roll his eyes, but he did lean back and he looked down and he said, okay. I said, give me just 2 weeks to see if I can find something. If not, I'll schedule it. He said, okay, Dean, it's your body. I'll do that. And that's when I found Dr. King Lee's research on forest bathing. He'd taken groups of 50 men at a time who'd had cancer. He'd walk them through the forest, and they'd walk through very mindfully, even sit and meditate. And what he found is there's an essential oil that comes out of trees that's imperceptible, called phytoncides. And those phytoncides boost the immune system anywhere from 50 to 300 times for 2 weeks. And so I thought, okay, if I go out to the forest, and I'd missed the forest for 30 years, so I was more than happy to do this. If I go, and his research was on, they would just be out for an hour or two. And I thought, okay, if I go out every week for 24 hours, and it boosts the immune system for 2 weeks, then it'll kind of become this beautiful snowball and almost exponentially heal me. And so I told Dr. Castro that's what I was going to do. And he winced. And I said, please just give me 6 months to see if this changes my blood counts and my condition at all. And he said, okay, if you'll take a blood test every other week, I'll give you the time you need.
Wow, nice.
Unless your blood counts really spike. And I said, that's a deal. So I started this in May of 2015, and by March of 2016, my lymphoma was totally gone. I was totally in remission there. And so in a very visceral, very dynamic way, I have seen that as humans, the reason we're all sick, anxious, depressed, addicted is because we are out of our natural habitat. Nature is our natural habitat. And if we're acting like natural wild humans, we will find what I call the wild cure way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, this is why it was so important for me to bring you here so everyone will hear this amazing story. That's it, in my opinion, too. I really believe that our disconnect from nature is what brings us all of this agony, the chronic disease, we're indoors all day long, unnatural light, exposed to so much poison, so many toxins in the food, in the air that we breathe, and we have to find a way to get back to our natural surrounding. It's so ridiculous what we're doing to ourselves.
Oh, it really is. And what essentially we've done is put ourselves in these artificial boxes and climate controlled rooms. We've created what I call the human zoo. And you look at any zoo animal, especially not a nice zoo, the old fashioned zoos, that they're just boxes and cages. And the zoo animals become listless, depressed, fat. They quit acting like themselves. And I think we are living in a human zoo of our own construction.
Yeah.
And so right now, that's really what I'm giving my life for. Yeah, I might swim another long river someday. I'd sure love to. I'd love to come over, especially to other places. I did.
Come here, you and your beautiful wife. Come here.
Let's talk more about that. Maybe that could be one of my next swims.
Yes.
But I want everybody to experience what I experienced. I still go out. I thought once my lymphoma healed, I'd probably quit that practice of staying out in the forest all day, every Friday. But it is the most efficient stress reduction and recharge and rejuvenation practice I've ever found. So I still go out every Friday all day. Everybody that knows me and all my clients know that they're never going to be able to get a hold of me on Fridays because I'm way out of cell phone range, way up in the mountains in my backpacking hammock, just reading and praying and then getting into a glacial stream. And I sleep better out there than anywhere else. It's just amazing. But everybody, one of the DMs I get the most now is, well, it's easy for you, Dean. You live in this beautiful place. And that is true. However, even when I was in Kansas, there were places I went to kind of reconnect and watch the sunset and connect with nature. And so
There's always a way.
Always. We live in this big, beautiful planet. And so my mission now for the rest of my life is to help people heal, grow, and learn to become themselves by getting more connected with nature. I've developed something I call Natura. It's nature adaptive therapy unifying rewilding and AI. I'm using AI I've developed a very specific, very unique personality type test and preference test. and a self-report fitness test, put those all together in what I call the Natura evaluation that I give to folks. And it puts you, each one of us, in one of 7 profiles. And then that determines how then I treat your coaching or whatever it is that you want to accomplish, because you're very unique and very specific. I say that every human is like a very sophisticated combination lock. If I was working with Shira, I'd need to find Shira's way. And those key components that work with you are going to work specifically with you. And even the way you connect with nature is going to probably be different than the way I connect with nature. And so we'd have to find your specific rewilding strategies that best fit your personality, your preference, and your fitness. And then I have AI analyze within a 50-mile radius of your geography and tell you exactly where you can do those rewilding strategies that best fit you. And right now, I'm going to start off with 10 individuals. I'm giving a bonus. We're calling it the December bonus collection. I'm starting with 10 individuals doing Natura, and then we're going to expand it more and more and more. So that's where I'm going. And I feel it takes my whole life and puts the 35 years of clinical practice as a therapist together with all this life experience. I feel like I was made to do this. So I'm really excited about what's ahead.
Very exciting. So definitely send me the links to put in the
Sure.
YouTube underneath. And also anyone, if you have questions for Dean, also you can go comment on the recording. So
right. And they can get me on my Instagram. It's at Dean Hall Official. And even though it's kind of become a full-time job, I promised I'd never be one of those guys that if somebody DMs me, I don't DM them back. And so if you DM me, unless you're really being awful, I'm going to DM you back. I'm going to answer you. So,
great. Yeah. And also, I really recommend your book. I loved it.
Oh, thank you.
Beautifully written. And Dean, what can I say? As one of the most amazing, beautiful stories I've ever heard. This podcast is called Inspire to Be Higher, and this is exactly what your story is doing. So I'm so happy that we managed finally to get you here. And yes. I really appreciate you also. You are so modest. You're saying I'm just a regular guy, but we all are. We're human.
Right.
But it's so beautiful. Really, thank you so much.
And thank you for the gifts you've given back. I can't tell you how many times I've thought of this dear friend and how even his name is Water. And it never occurred to me. So I truly have been touched and healed by water.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much, everyone. Also, keep on being inspired, and we'll see you next time. תודה שהייתם איתנו עד סוף הפרק. אני מקווה שמצאתם השראה בתוכן של היום. אם נהניתם, אני מבקשת שתשתפו את הפרק הזה אפילו רק עם בן אדם אחד. כך נוכל להפיץ יותר תקווה, ריפוי ושינוי חיובי בעולם. למידע נוסף אתם מוזמנים לבקר באתר שלי shiramed.com. תודה, וניפגש בפרק הבא.